There are moments in life when the mind begins to question what the heart already knows. Doubt does not always arise from reality. It often emerges from within, shaped by old wounds, past disappointments, and fears that were never fully understood. In such moments, love is not lost. It is simply being filtered through inner confusion. When a connection is genuine, it does not rely on constant reassurance or dramatic displays. It exists in a quieter form, one that does not demand attention but remains steady beneath the surface of emotional fluctuation. The modern mind, however, often misinterprets silence as absence and space as abandonment. This is where distortion begins. Much of what people perceive in relationships is not the other person itself, but a reflection of their own inner world. When insecurity is present, the psyche unconsciously projects uncertainty outward. The partner becomes a screen upon which fear is displayed. What is actually internal unrest is mistaken for external disinterest. But true connection behaves differently. It does not collapse under temporary distance. It does not vanish when emotions become complex. Instead, it reveals its depth precisely in those moments when misunderstanding appears. What is authentic tends to persist even when the surface becomes unclear. There is also a deeper truth. Love that is meaningful is rarely free from tension. Growth between two individuals requires movement through discomfort. The psyche resists this process because it prefers certainty over transformation, yet that transformation is exactly where deeper bonds are formed. To give up too quickly is often to abandon not only the relationship, but also the inner process it was meant to awaken. Many connections enter life not simply for comfort, but for reflection. They expose hidden parts of the self, parts that seek recognition rather than escape. When emotional intensity arises, it is not always a signal to withdraw. Sometimes it is a sign that something within is being activated, asking to be understood rather than avoided. The mind may interpret this activation as danger, but the deeper layer of the psyche often recognizes it as growth. If someone truly loves you, it is rarely loud in its certainty. It is steady in its presence, even when tested by confusion. It does not require perfection to continue existing. It adapts, endures, and quietly remains aligned with something deeper than momentary emotion. So in moments of doubt, the question is not only, do they love me, but also what within me is creating this uncertainty? Because often clarity about the other begins with clarity about the self. What is meant for you does not require force to remain in your life. And what is real does not dissolve simply because the mind temporarily cannot see it clearly. Much of doubt in relationships arises from projection of inner wounds onto the other person. What appears at first glance to be uncertainty about the partner is often not rooted in the partner's actual behavior, but in unresolved emotional material within the self. The psyche has a natural tendency to externalize inner tension, especially when that tension has not been consciously recognized or integrated. In this process, the other person becomes a screen upon which internal fears, insecurities, and past emotional injuries are silently projected. Projection is not a deliberate act, it is an unconscious mechanism. When the inner world carries unresolved experiences of abandonment, rejection, betrayal, or inconsistency, these emotional imprints do not remain isolated in memory. Instead, they become active patterns that influence perception in the present moment. A neutral gesture may be interpreted as withdrawal. A moment of silence may be perceived as disinterest, and a temporary emotional distance may feel like permanent loss. The external situation remains relatively simple, but the internal interpretation becomes layered with emotional history. In this way, the partner is no longer seen as they truly are, but as a mixture of who they are and what they unconsciously represent. They become associated with earlier figures or experiences that shaped emotional sensitivity. The present relationship is then unconsciously linked to past relational wounds, and responses to current situations are influenced more by memory than by reality. This is why doubt can sometimes feel disproportionate to the actual circumstances. The psyche seeks coherence, even when that coherence is based on distortion. When internal wounds remain unhealed, the mind attempts to make sense of emotional discomfort by assigning it to something external. It is easier for the mind to believe that something is wrong with the relationship than to confront the deeper possibility that something within is being activated. This defense preserves psychological equilibrium in the short term, but it creates confusion in perception. As a result, a partner becomes a symbolic figure rather than a fully seen individual. They are burdened with meanings they did not consciously create. Expectations, fears, and unresolved emotional narratives are placed onto them without awareness. When they behave in ways that do not align with these internal projections, doubt emerges. The mismatch is not necessarily between two people, but between inner expectation and external reality. This dynamic creates a subtle distortion in emotional interpretation. Instead of observing what is actually happening, the mind reacts to what it fears might be happening. The present moment is filtered through emotional residue from the past. In this state, clarity becomes difficult because perception is no longer neutral. It is influenced by unconscious emotional charges that color experience. What is often misunderstood in relationships is that emotional intensity does not always indicate relational truth. Sometimes the strongest emotional reactions are not responses to present reality, but echoes of older emotional wounds being reactivated. The partner may simply have triggered a sensitive area within the psyche, not caused it. Yet the feeling of doubt becomes directed outward, as if the source of discomfort lies entirely in the other person. To recognize projection is not to dismiss genuine relational concerns, but to begin distinguishing between external reality and internal reaction. It is the beginning of psychological clarity. When projection is unconscious, the other person carries emotional weight that does not belong to them. When projection becomes conscious, perception begins to shift. The partner is seen more accurately, and the emotional response becomes less distorted by internal history. In deeper understanding, doubt is not always a signal of external instability. Often it is an invitation to turn inward and recognize what within is being activated. The relationship then becomes not only a connection between two individuals, but also a mirror reflecting unprocessed layers of the self. In that recognition, perception begins to soften, and the boundary between past wound and present reality becomes clearer, allowing experience to be seen with greater honesty and less distortion. The unconscious often distorts perception when insecurity is unexamined. In such moments, what a person sees, feels, and interprets is no longer a direct reflection of reality, but a layered construction shaped by inner instability. The unconscious does not operate through rational analysis. It operates through emotional memory, symbolic association, and deeply ingrained psychological patterns. When insecurity remains unrecognized, it quietly becomes the lens through which the world is experienced, especially in emotionally charged relationships. Unexamined insecurity does not announce itself clearly. It works subtly, beneath awareness, influencing interpretation before conscious thought can intervene. A simple delay in response can feel like rejection, a neutral expression can be read as disinterest, and a temporary withdrawal can be experienced as abandonment. The external event remains ordinary, but the internal interpretation transforms it into something emotionally significant. In this transformation, perception is no longer neutral. It becomes charged with meaning that originates from within rather than from the actual situation. The unconscious tends to fill gaps in understanding with emotionally familiar patterns. If a person carries unresolved experiences of inconsistency, neglect, or emotional uncertainty, the mind may unconsciously expect similar patterns to reappear in new situations. As a result, even stable relationships can be perceived through the filter of anticipated instability. This is not because instability is present, but because the psyche has been conditioned to anticipate it. Expectation then shapes perception, and perception reinforces expectation, creating a loop that feels convincing even when it is not accurate. Insecurity also alters the threshold of interpretation. When inner stability is weak, the mind becomes highly sensitive to small variations in behavior or tone. These variations are magnified and assigned meaning that exceeds their actual significance. What might be a simple moment of distraction or fatigue in another person is interpreted as emotional distance or lack of care. The unconscious does not evaluate context, it reacts based on emotional resonance. If something resonates with a past wound, it is immediately amplified in importance. This distortion is not intentional. It arises from the psyche's attempt to protect itself from perceived emotional threat. The mind prefers to create a narrative, even a painful one, rather than remain in uncertainty. Uncertainty is psychologically uncomfortable, especially for a mind shaped by insecurity. So the unconscious generates meaning quickly, even if that meaning is inaccurate. because interpretation feels safer than ambiguity. In doing so, it sacrifices accuracy for emotional certainty. Over time, this pattern can affect how relationships are experienced at a fundamental level. The partner is no longer seen directly, but through a constantly shifting emotional filter. Their actions are interpreted in relation to internal fear rather than in relation to their actual intent. This creates misunderstanding not because of what is happening externally, but because of how it is being internally processed. The relationship becomes a space where internal insecurity is continuously projected outward and then misread as external reality. What makes this process particularly subtle is that it feels real. The emotions generated by unconscious distortion are genuine in intensity, even if they are not grounded in accurate perception. This is why insecurity can be so convincing. It produces real emotional experiences based on distorted interpretations, making it difficult to distinguish between feeling and fact. The intensity of emotion gives weight to the interpretation, reinforcing the belief that what is felt must also be what is true. Yet when awareness begins to enter this process, something shifts. It becomes possible to observe that not every emotional reaction corresponds directly to external reality. Some reactions are echoes of internal history, activated by present circumstances but not created by them. This recognition does not immediately dissolve insecurity, but it introduces space between perception and reaction. In that space, distortion begins to lose its absolute authority. The unconscious continues to influence experience, but it is no longer entirely unseen. And when it is seen, even partially, its power to fully shape perception begins to weaken. What remains is a gradual reorientation toward clearer seeing, where external reality is no longer entirely overwritten by internal fear, and where understanding becomes less reactive and more grounded in what is actually present rather than what is unconsciously assumed. What is truly aligned with your inner self does not disappear easily, even when tested. In the deeper layers of human experience, alignment is not a surface-level preference or a passing emotional agreement. It is something that resonates with the core structure of the psyche, often beyond immediate rational understanding. When something is genuinely aligned with the inner self, it carries a kind of psychological continuity that persists even when external conditions become unstable or challenging. Many connections, decisions, and experiences appear strong only in moments of ease. When circumstances are favorable, the mind often interprets comfort as certainty. However, comfort alone does not reveal depth. It is in moments of disruption, distance, misunderstanding, or emotional pressure that the true nature of alignment begins to reveal itself. What is superficial tends to dissolve under strain, while what is rooted in deeper psychological congruence tends to endure in some form, even if its expression temporarily changes. The inner self does not operate purely through logic or immediate emotion. It is shaped by a complex interplay of unconscious recognition, lived experience, and intuitive resonance. When something aligns with this deeper layer, it does not depend entirely on external validation to remain meaningful. Even when tested by time or uncertainty, there remains a subtle internal recognition that does not fully disappear. The outer form may shift, communication may pause, or clarity may temporarily fade, but the underlying sense of significance does not vanish completely. In contrast, what is not aligned often requires constant reinforcement to sustain itself. It depends heavily on external confirmation, emotional intensity, or continuous reassurance to maintain its perceived importance. When that reinforcement weakens, the connection or belief often collapses quickly, revealing that its foundation was primarily situational rather than deeply integrated. This is why some experiences fade rapidly once conditions change, while others remain psychologically present even in their absence. Testing plays a crucial role in revealing this difference. Life naturally introduces situations that challenge emotional certainty. Distance, silence, misunderstanding, or change in circumstance often act as psychological pressure points. These moments do not necessarily destroy what is real. Instead, they expose what is structurally strong versus what is dependent on temporary conditions. What is aligned with the inner self may experience discomfort under such tests, but it does not lose its core significance easily. There is also a deeper psychological dimension to alignment that involves recognition rather than construction. Some experiences feel as though they are not entirely created by effort alone, but are recognized by something within. This recognition creates a sense of familiarity that persists even when clarity is disrupted. It is not always easy to explain in rational terms, yet it remains present beneath emotional fluctuations. This is why certain connections or inner truths continue to feel significant even after periods of confusion or distance. However, it is important to understand that endurance does not always mean permanency in external form. What is aligned may change shape, evolve, or temporarily withdraw from visibility. What remains consistent is the internal imprint it leaves. The psyche retains this imprint, and even when conscious attention moves away, something within continues to register its importance. This is different from attachment based purely on habit or emotional dependency, which often weakens significantly once external reinforcement is removed. The testing of alignment is not always dramatic. Sometimes it appears in subtle shifts of perception, in moments of doubt, or in periods where clarity feels temporarily absent. In such moments, the question is not always about immediate certainty, but about whether something continues to hold meaning even in its quieter or less accessible form. What is deeply aligned tends to resist complete erasure from the inner landscape even when it is not actively present in experience. In psychological terms, this persistence reflects a deeper form of integration within the self. When something resonates with core values, emotional truth, or unconscious recognition, it becomes part of the internal structure of meaning. It may be challenged, questioned, or temporarily obscured, but it does not dissolve without leaving a trace, and that trace often continues to influence perception, feeling, and understanding long after the surface experience has changed.